The dust didn't move, not even when the 17 men stepped closer. Boots formed a loose ring around her, leather creaking, spurs clicking softly like warning bells. The woman stood barefoot in the dirt, her wrists wrapped in cloth so thin it barely hid the bone. She didn't raise her head. She didn't flinch. The wind tugged at the loose fabric of her uniform, and one of the cowboys noticed something that made him stop breathing. She was shaking, not from fear, from cold. Someone muttered in English. Someone else took off his hat. No one touched her. The rifles stayed slung, forgotten, and yet, for a long moment, no one moved, because none of them had expected this. They had been told she was the enemy. They had been told to be ready. But as the sun burned overhead and the circle tightened, one silent question hung between all of them. What do you do when the war hands you a life you were never prepared to hold? And that question, unanswered, changed everything. The dust didn't settle because no one let it. Boots shifted, heels grinding down into the dry Texas soil until the ground itself seemed pressed flat by their weight. 17 pairs of boots, scuffed leather, cracked toes, spurs dulled from years of riding fence lines, formed a loose ring that tightened without a word being spoken. The circle wasn't perfect. It never is. Gaps opened and closed as men adjusted their stance, unsure whether they were standing guard or standing witness. Each step left a fresh print, darker than the surrounding dirt, as if the ground was recording the moment for later. At the center of it all were her feet, bare, pale beneath a crust of dust. The skin along her heels was split, thin lines packed with grit, the toes swollen enough that the nails curved slightly inward. One foot trembled, just enough to kick up a faint puff of powder, and a few of the men noticed at the same time. Not fear. Fear looks different. This was the shiver of a body that had burned through whatever it had left to burn. Cold, even under a sun that pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. The wind slid across the open land and tugged at her uniform, fabric so loose it snapped softly against her legs. It hung from her frame like it had been borrowed from someone else entirely. When the cloth lifted, the outline of her knees showed, sharp, knotted, the skin stretched tight over bone. One cowboy shifted his weight, and the leather of his boot creaked loud enough to sound like a mistake. He froze, as if noise itself might tip something fragile past the point of repair. No one gave an order. Rifles stayed slung over shoulders, straps biting into denim. One man reached up and loosened his collar, the sweat beneath it turning the fabric darker by the second. Another spat into the dirt, the sound landing heavy in the silence, and immediately wished he hadn't. The circle held, boots planted, but the posture was wrong for threat. Elbows stayed loose. Hands hovered near belts, but didn't touch the metal there. This wasn't how you stood around someone you planned to hurt. Her knees dipped, just a fraction, and she caught herself by locking them straight again. The movement rippled outward. A hat came off. Another followed. The sound of felt brushing denim was small, but it carried. One man bent slightly at the waist, resting his palms on his thighs, trying to get a better look without stepping closer. From where he stood, he could see the way her shoulders rose and fell, quick, shallow pulls of air that fluttered the collar of her uniform. Each breath rattled faintly, like dry paper being folded too many times. The circle pressed into the dirt deeper as time stretched. The sun climbed higher, baking the ground until it smelled faintly of clay and iron. Flies drifted in, buzzing lazily, landing on sleeves, on cheeks, on the back of one man's neck where sweat had pooled. No one swatted them away. Eyes stayed locked on the center, on the woman whose head never lifted, whose hair, dark, unevenly cut, stuck to her face in damp strands. A spur jingled, too loud. The man who'd moved stilled instantly, jaw tightening as if he could pull the sound back into himself. The circle adjusted again, boots scraping, closing a gap without anyone agreeing to do it. From above, it might have looked deliberate. On the ground, it felt accidental, like gravity doing what gravity always does. She swayed once more. This time it was her shoulders that tipped, her balance wavering just enough that one foot slid forward, dragging a thin line through the dust. The mark cut across the center of the circle, fragile and unmistakable. A few of the cowboys followed it with their eyes, tracking the shallow groove until it stopped against the toe of a boot. No one stepped on it. No one crossed it. The silence stretched, thick as the heat, longer than any shouted command ever had. It pressed into ears, into chests, into the ground beneath their feet. And in that stillness, boots planted, dust hanging, a ring drawn in dirt, 17 men realized the same thing at once. The circle wasn't holding her in. It was holding something else together. The barn door groaned as it slid open, the sound long and raw, like wood complaining after years of silence. Light spilled in through the gap, cutting a pale stripe across the packed dirt floor and stopping at the legs of a metal scale set near the center of the space. The barn smelled of iodine, hay, and old iron, sharp and sweet all at once. Dust floated in the air, slow and lazy, catching in the sunlight like ash that refused to fall. She stepped inside barefoot, the dirt cool beneath her soles after the heat outside. Each step left a faint print that vanished almost immediately under the scuff of boots behind her. The circle from outside did not follow her in. It broke apart at the threshold, men peeling away to lean against posts, to rest hands on hips, to give space they hadn't known how to give a moment earlier. Inside the barn, the sound changed. No wind, just breathing, leather shifting, a distant creak as a beam settled under its own weight. The scale waited. It was old, its metal frame dulled and nicked, the platform scratched from years of boots and crates and feed sacks. The needle sat crooked behind cloudy glass, frozen at 0, as if it had forgotten how to move. A medic stood beside it, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms streaked with faint iodine stains that never quite washed out. He wiped his hands on a towel once, then again, though they were already clean. She hesitated at the edge of the platform. The medic tapped the metal lightly with 2 fingers, the sound sharp in the quiet. She stepped up. The platform dipped under her weight with a hollow clank. The needle jumped hard to the right, rattled, then wobbled back. The sound it made was wrong, too loud for something so small. The glass vibrated, buzzing softly, and then the needle slowed. It quivered once more, like it might change its mind, and finally settled. The medic leaned in. He didn't speak. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. One hand came up to steady the scale, fingers curling around the cold metal frame as if it might tip over. He squinted at the numbers, then straightened without saying a word. The silence that followed was heavier than the one outside, pressed down by beams and roof and the smell of antiseptic. Behind her, boots shuffled. One man cleared his throat and immediately turned his head toward the far wall. Another reached up and took off his hat, the motion slow, deliberate, like he was setting something fragile down. Felt brushed against denim as the hat was folded in both hands, thumbs worrying the brim. A third man shifted his stance, feet spreading wider, as if the ground itself had gone unsteady. She stood on the scale without moving, her shoulders slumped forward slightly, the bones beneath the fabric making sharp lines where curves should have been. The uniform sagged off her frame, sleeves hanging past wrists, so thin the cuffs swallowed them. When she breathed, her collar rose and fell against a chest that barely pushed back. The medic noticed the way her knees locked, the muscles there quivering as she tried to keep upright. He reached out, not touching her, just hovering a hand near her elbow in case she tipped. His other hand pointed at the scale, at the needle that had stopped moving. 68, he said quietly. The word did not echo. It didn't need to. It landed and stayed. A sound like air leaving a tire moved through the barn. Not a gasp, not a word. Just a collective release of breath men hadn't realized they were holding. One cowboy leaned back against a post and closed his eyes for a moment, jaw working as if he were chewing on something tough. Another turned his shoulders away entirely, staring into a dark corner where old tack hung from nails, leather straps stiff with age. No one looked at her face. They didn't need to. The number did what rifles and orders had failed to do. It stripped away the last shape of threat and left only the outline of a body that had been carried too far on too little. The physical anchor shifted there, on that metal platform. The circle in the dirt was gone, replaced by a measurement you couldn't argue with, couldn't step back from. The medic cleared his throat and reached for a blanket folded over a nearby crate. It was rough wool, army issue, heavy for its size. He draped it over her shoulders, and it slid down until it caught at her elbows, the weight enough to make her sway. He steadied her this time, fingers closing gently around bone wrapped in skin, his grip careful, like he was holding something that might crack. She stepped off the scale. The needle snapped back to 0 with a sharp click, the sound almost angry in the quiet barn. The medic stared at it for a moment, then at his own hands. Outside, the sun burned on, unaware. Inside, hats stayed off, eyes stayed low, and the barn, filled with the smell of hay and iodine and the truth of a single number, held a fragile body where a threat had been expected, and nothing felt the same anymore. Outside, the wind worried at a scrap of paper caught near the barn door. It scraped along the dirt, lifted, folded over itself, then slapped back down again with a dry, brittle sound. One corner was torn clean away. Another was darkened with a boot print. The leaflet skidded in short, nervous bursts, stopping just long enough for its image to show before the wind dragged it forward again. Bold ink, sharp lines, a caricature of an enemy meant to look monstrous, broad-shouldered and snarling, teeth exaggerated, fists raised. The colors had faded under the sun, but the message was still legible. Inside the barn, the woman's ribs rose beneath the blanket with each breath, pressing the wool outward in shallow, uneven lifts. The medic noticed it first, then one of the cowboys did. The contrast landed without words. The paper outside promised a threat that filled the frame. The body inside barely filled the space it occupied. She swayed on her feet, still standing close to the scale. The metal platform was cold now, heat leached away by the air inside. Her fingers slid out from beneath the blanket and closed around the edge of it, knuckles whitening as they found purchase on chipped paint and rust. The scale creaked softly under the shift of her weight, a complaint too small to draw attention, but loud enough to carry in the quiet room. She leaned into it, shoulders folding forward, ribs visible where the blanket parted. One cowboy stepped closer to the open door and nudged the leaflet with the toe of his boot. It flipped once, landing face up. The image stared back at him. He frowned, then scraped it farther away, grinding it into the dirt until the paper tore again. He didn't bend to pick it up. He didn't need to. The sight inside had already done the work. Another man leaned against a post and rubbed the bridge of his nose with thumb and forefinger, leaving a faint streak of dust across his skin. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman's hands, gripping the scale, on the way her wrists disappeared inside the sleeves of her uniform. The cuffs hung loose, frayed threads brushing her fingers. Each breath drew her ribs into sharper relief, shadows forming and disappearing in the shallow valleys between bone. The medic cleared his throat and shifted his stance, boots scraping against packed dirt. He reached out and steadied the scale again, palm flat against the frame. The metal vibrated faintly, the sound traveling up into his arm. He glanced at the woman's grip, at the way her fingers trembled against the chipped edge, then at the leaflet just visible beyond the threshold. He followed the line between them with his eyes, from inked threat to living measurement. No one spoke about it. No one needed to. The wind shoved the leaflet again, flipping it over so the blank back faced the sky. The sound of paper dragging over dirt slid into the barn, thin and persistent. One cowboy's jaw tightened. Another adjusted his hat, then stopped and let it hang loose in his hands instead. A third shifted his feet farther apart, grounding himself as if the floor had tilted. The woman's breath caught once, a short hitch that pulled her ribs tight under the blanket. The medic's hand hovered near her elbow again, not touching. She tightened her grip on the scale, nails scraping softly against metal. The sound made a few heads turn. It was small, almost nothing, but it was real. Outside, the leaflet finally tore free and lifted into the air, spinning once before slapping against the fence and sticking there, held fast by a twisted wire. The image was bent now, distorted, the face warped by creases and shadow. Inside, belief didn't shatter. It bent. The men did not look at the paper again. They looked at the woman, at the way her shoulders sagged as she leaned on the scale, at the way the blanket slipped and had to be pulled back into place. The physical anchor had changed shape. It was no longer a circle drawn in dirt or a number on a dial. It was the weight of her body pressing into metal, the sound of her breathing filling the space between them. The leaflet stayed where it was, pinned and useless, fluttering weakly against the fence. And inside the barn, the truth stood upright, only because it had something solid to hold on to. The medic reached for the blanket without ceremony. It had been folded tight on a wooden crate, edges squared, the coarse wool compressed into thick layers that smelled faintly of storage dust and soap that had long since faded. When he lifted it, the weight showed in the way his wrists dipped. It was heavier than it looked, dense and stubborn, the kind meant to keep heat in and weather out. He shook it once to open it, and the sound of wool snapping through the air cut clean through the silence. He stepped closer. Not too close. Close enough. The blanket settled over her shoulders with a dull thump, the fabric sliding down until it caught against the angles of her collarbones. It swallowed her frame immediately, the excess hanging past her elbows, past her waist, nearly to her calves. The scratch of the wool drew a sharp intake of breath from her throat. She stiffened, shoulders rising, then slowly sank as the warmth began to press inward. The contrast was visible. The barn air was cool, but the blanket held what little heat her body could give it, trapping it there. Her hands came out from beneath the folds before anyone realized she had moved. Fingers thin and pale closed around the edge of the wool, bunching it tight against her chest. The fabric wrinkled under her grip, creases forming where her knuckles pressed in. She pulled it closer without looking down, the motion quick and instinctive, like a reflex that hadn't been used in a long time. One cowboy shifted his stance and stopped halfway through the movement. He had meant to step back, to give space, but instead he found himself standing still, hat still in his hands. The brim bent slightly as his fingers tightened. Another man cleared his throat and turned his shoulders toward the wall, boots scraping softly against dirt. A third leaned forward, hands braced on his knees, then straightened again, uncertain what to do with his arms. The blanket changed the room. Where the scale had drawn their eyes downward, the wool pulled them in closer, narrowing the space between watching and witnessing. The medic adjusted the fabric at her shoulders, careful not to let his fingers linger. The wool rasped quietly as it moved, a dry, steady sound. He stepped back once the blanket sat properly, arms dropping to his sides. She shifted her weight, the scale no longer beneath her feet, the metal now replaced by packed dirt and scattered straw. The blanket slid with her movement, heavy but steady, the hem brushing her ankles. Her grip tightened again, fingertips pressing deeper into the weave. The wool left faint impressions on her skin where it touched her wrists, a pattern of rough lines that stood out against the pale. The men watched without speaking. Their posture had changed. Rifles stayed slung, but hands no longer hovered near them. Backs straightened, heads lowered slightly. One man folded his hat and tucked it under his arm. Another set his against a post, letting it hang there instead of holding it. No one crossed the space between them and her, but no one edged away either. The barn creaked as a beam shifted overhead. Dust drifted down in a slow curtain, settling on boots, on shoulders, on the blanket itself. The wool darkened in spots where dust clung, but she didn't brush it away. Her fingers stayed locked in place, thumbs rubbing the same small patch over and over, as if testing whether the fabric would disappear if she let go. Outside, the wind pressed against the barn wall, a low, steady push. Inside, the blanket held. It turned exposure into shelter with nothing more than weight and warmth. The cowboys stood there long enough for the realization to settle into their bones. They were no longer forming a perimeter. They were standing around something fragile, something that had already been broken once. The medic glanced at the men, then back at the woman, then away again. No orders followed. None were needed. The blanket had done what commands could not. It marked the moment. From that point on, they were not guards watching an enemy. They were witnesses, standing still, while a single piece of wool changed what the war had left behind. The first thing that moved was the steam. It curled upward from a tin cup, thin white strands twisting in the cool barn air before breaking apart and vanishing near the rafters. The cup itself was dull gray, its rim nicked and bent from use. The metal darkened where countless hands had held it. Inside, the surface of the liquid trembled slightly with each step that crossed the dirt floor. Beef, onion, fat. The smell traveled faster than the man carrying it, spreading through the barn in a warm wave that pushed aside the sharp sting of iodine and the dry sweetness of hay. Her head lifted a fraction. Not enough to meet anyone's eyes, just enough for the scent to reach her fully. The cowboy, holding the cup, slowed as he approached, boots careful now, each step placed softly, as if sound itself might spoil something. He stopped a few paces away, close enough for the steam to brush her face. The blanket shifted as she inhaled, the wool rising and falling against her ribs. Her fingers tightened reflexively, bunching the fabric higher against her chest, but her feet did not move. The smell pressed in again, thicker this time. The heat of it reached her before the cup did, a faint warmth against her knuckles where they peeked from the blanket's edge. Her hands loosened their grip on the wool and hovered, uncertain, fingers flexing once as if testing the air. The cowboy knelt instead of stepping closer. His knee sank into the dirt with a soft crunch. He held the cup out at chest height for a moment, then thought better of it. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered it to the ground between them. The metal touched dirt with a muted clink. A few drops sloshed against the rim, leaving dark stains that spread outward in small, uneven rings. He did not push it toward her. He did not say a word. He straightened, brushing dirt from his knee, and stepped back. One step, then another. He turned slightly, presenting his shoulder instead of his chest, eyes fixed on the far wall. The space he left behind felt intentional, measured, trust offered without ceremony. The steam continued to rise. Her gaze dropped to the cup. The smell wrapped around her now, heavy and unmistakable. Her shoulders dipped forward as if pulled by it. She took one small step, then stopped, toes curling in the dirt. The blanket slipped, exposing more of her wrists. She tugged it back into place with one hand, while the other reached out, slow and shaking. Her fingers closed around the cup. The heat surprised her. The metal burned against her palms, sharp enough that her breath hitched audibly. She nearly let go. Instead, she shifted her grip, sliding her hands down until the heat settled into something she could hold. Her thumbs rested against the rim, skin reddening where they touched. The men watched from where they stood. No one moved closer. One cowboy leaned back against a post, arms crossed loosely, chin tucked down. Another adjusted his stance, boots spreading wider, grounding himself. A third wiped his palms against his trousers, then let them hang at his sides. She lifted the cup slowly, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the edge. The smell intensified, filling her nose, coating the back of her throat. Her lips parted. Steam brushed her cheeks, dampening the fine hairs along her jaw. She paused. The heat seeped deeper into her hands now, into her wrists, up her arms. Her fingers tightened around the cup's thin walls, knuckles whitening. The blanket slid again, but she didn't notice. Her focus stayed on the cup, on the way the surface rippled with her breath. Finally, she tipped it just enough for the broth to touch her lips. The sound she made was small and involuntary, a quick intake of air as the heat met her mouth. She pulled the cup back an inch, then steadied it again. The cowboy who had brought it shifted his weight, then stilled, as if even that might intrude. She took a sip. The steam thinned. The smell lingered. And in the quiet barn, with wool on her shoulders and heat in her hands, the war loosened its grip by one careful, wordless offering placed on the dirt. She lifted the cup again, higher this time, the thin metal rattling softly as her hands shook. The broth slid toward the rim, thick with grease that caught the light in dull orange patches. A strip of meat floated near the surface, pale and swollen, its edges frayed from long simmering. Steam rose and clung to her face, dampening her lashes, beading along her upper lip. The smell deepened as the cup tipped, beef and onion layered with salt, heavy enough to press against the back of her throat. Her lips parted. The rim touched her mouth. She drank too fast. The heat surged in, sharp and sudden, and her body reacted before anyone could move. Her shoulders jerked, the blanket slipping down one arm as she gagged, a dry, startled sound tearing from her chest. Broth spilled over the rim, splashing onto the dirt and darkening it in uneven blotches. A few drops streaked her chin, catching briefly on the curve before sliding down onto the wool. The meat bumped against her teeth, soft but resistant, and she pulled the cup away with a sharp breath, chest heaving. Boots shifted all around her. One cowboy took a step forward and stopped himself halfway, heel hovering before settling back into place. Another reached out instinctively, fingers splayed, then froze with his hands suspended in the air. No one spoke. The barn seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward with every shallow breath she took. She swallowed hard. The motion was visible, her throat working as she forced the heat and taste down. Her mouth twisted again, jaw tightening, eyes squeezing shut for a brief second as if bracing against a blow. Then her shoulders dropped a fraction. She inhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, the steam filling her lungs again. Her grip on the cup adjusted, fingers sliding to a steadier hold despite the burn. She took another sip, smaller, controlled. This time, when the meat brushed her lips, she bit down. Her teeth sank through it with a faint tearing sound, fibers parting easily. Grease coated her mouth instantly, slick and heavy, spreading across her tongue. Her jaw worked, slow and mechanical, chewing as if following an old instruction remembered by muscle alone. The blanket shifted with the movement, wool rasping softly against her wrist. She gagged again, a quick reflex, but her hands tightened around the cup and did not let go. She swallowed. The sound was quiet but distinct, a single, final motion that stilled the room. A breath escaped her nose, shaky and uneven, fogging the air in front of her face. Her lips shone with grease now, catching the light. She licked them once, tentative, as if surprised by what was there. The cowboys watched without blinking. One leaned against a post, the wood creaking under his weight, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of her shoulders. Another lowered his head, staring at the dirt where broth had spilled, then lifted his gaze back to the cup in her hands. A third folded his arms tightly across his chest, fingers digging into his sleeves. She ate again. Another bite, then another. Each mouthful came with a pause, her body testing the ground beneath her, testing the heat in her hands, the weight of food settling into a place that had been empty for too long. The gagging faded, replaced by careful chewing, steady swallowing. The cup grew lighter as the liquid level dropped, the metal warming her palms all the way through. The physical anchor shifted there, in plain sight. Where fear had held her rigid, nourishment pulled her forward, inch by inch. Her stance widened slightly for balance. Her shoulders straightened just enough to keep the cup level. The blanket stayed draped over her back, but it no longer swallowed her entirely. She was anchored now by heat, by weight, by the simple act of eating, while 17 men stood silent and bore witness. No one looked away. The table sat near the back of the barn, rough pine boards scarred by years of use, its surface etched with shallow cuts and dark rings where tin cups had once rested too long. A short pencil rolled across it, pushed by an unseen hand, wobbling as it went. The wood was chewed down to a stub, the yellow paint worn thin, the graphite tip blunted and gray. It clicked softly as it bumped against a knot in the grain, changed direction, and finally came to rest against her fingers. The contact was light, barely a touch, enough to be felt. Her hand jerked back an inch, then hovered, suspended above the table. The blanket slipped from her shoulder and dragged against the wood with a dry rasp. The pencil stayed where it was, pressing gently into the side of her index finger. She stared at it, eyes fixed on the smudged tip, on the faint black dust clinging to the wood beneath it. The paper lay beside it, folded once, edges uneven. It was thin, almost translucent, the grain visible where light filtered through the gaps in the barn wall. A corner lifted and settled again as a draft moved through the space. The smell of broth still lingered, faint now, mixed with hay and old timber. A man in uniform stood a few steps back. He did not point. He did not speak. He set his hands on his belt and waited. Her fingers crept forward, slow and cautious. When she touched the pencil this time, it rolled slightly, leaving a short gray streak across the paper. Her hand stilled. The tremor was visible now, running from wrist to fingertip, shaking the stub just enough to make it rattle against the table. She picked it up. The pencil felt lighter than expected, almost fragile. The wood warm from having rolled in the sunlit dust. She adjusted her grip twice before it settled, thumb and forefinger pinching too close to the tip. Graphite smeared her skin immediately, leaving a dark crescent along her nail. She rubbed at it with her other hand, then stopped, as if realizing the mark could not be undone. The paper slid as she pulled it closer. Its edge caught against a splinter in the table, tearing slightly with a quiet rip. The sound made her flinch. One cowboy shifted his weight. Another leaned back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the pencil instead of her face. She lowered the point to the page. It did not move. Her hand hovered there, trembling harder now, the pencil vibrating faintly between her fingers. The paper showed every shake, the tip bouncing just above the surface, threatening to leave a mark before she was ready. The barn seemed to hold its breath. Dust hung motionless in the air. She pressed down. The graphite scratched against the paper with a dry, unmistakable sound. A short line appeared, crooked and dark. She lifted the pencil at once, breath catching, as if surprised by how easily it had happened. The line stayed. It did not fade. It did not lift away with the pencil. She swallowed and set the point down again. This time she moved it deliberately. Slow strokes, each one audible. The paper rasped under the pressure, fibers parting. Her hand shook, but it kept moving, dragging the graphite across the page. When she finished the first word, she paused, pencil hovering, knuckles white. She wrote the second without looking up. 2 words sat on the paper, uneven and small. Letters pressed too hard in places, too light in others. Graphite dust smudged the edges where her palm had brushed them. They were plain, simple, impossible to take back. She set the pencil down. It rolled a fraction of an inch, then stopped again, this time against the fold of the paper. Her hand stayed where it was, fingers curled, nails digging into the wood. The tremor slowed, not gone, controlled. The man in uniform stepped forward and picked up the paper. He did not read it aloud. He folded it once more and slid it into an envelope. The sound of paper against paper was soft, but final. She drew the blanket back around her shoulders and straightened. The pencil remained on the table, shorter than before, graphite dull and spent. Nothing else was said. The barn exhaled, and the mark she had made stayed where it was, small, dark, and irreversible. Night came softly, without announcement. The fire was already burning by the time she stepped outside, a shallow pit scraped into the dirt, its edges ringed with stones blackened by soot. Flames leaned and straightened as the wind moved through them, their light jumping across faces and hands and the low fence beyond. Smoke rolled low before lifting, sharp and dry, carrying the smell of mesquite and ash. It caught at the back of her throat and made her blink hard, eyes watering as she drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She sat where she was shown, close enough to feel the heat, but not close enough for sparks to land. The dirt beneath her was still warm from the day, gritty against her palms when she shifted. Around her, the cowboys settled in loose positions, one squatting on his heels, another leaning back on his elbows, a third standing with one boot propped on a stone. No one crowded her. The circle this time was wider, uneven, open to the dark beyond the firelight. A harmonica sounded. It was low at first, a single breath pushed through metal, the note thin and wavering before it steadied. The sound threaded through the crackle of burning wood, rising and falling, bending in a way that didn't match any tune she knew. The man playing it tilted his head, eyes half closed, fingers moving slightly as he shaped the sound. The harmonica gleamed dully in the firelight, its surface scratched and worn smooth by years of use. The sound did something the fire alone had not. Her shoulders loosened a fraction. The blanket slid down her arm, exposing her wrist to the heat. She did not pull it back right away. The warmth pressed into her skin, steady and real. The smoke shifted again, stinging her eyes, and she blinked rapidly, a hand coming up to wipe the moisture away with the back of her fingers. Someone laughed. It burst out sudden and sharp, then cut off just as quickly, as if the man had surprised himself. Another chuckle followed, softer this time, carried on the wind. Boots scuffed, a hat tipped back. The harmonica bent into a brighter note, answering the sound without stopping. The laughter did not come from relief. It came from the sound itself, from the way it filled the open space and left no room for the quiet that had lived there before. She watched the flames. They leaned toward each other, split apart, collapsed into glowing coals before flaring back up again. A log shifted with a hollow pop, sending a spray of sparks into the air. She flinched once, then stilled as the sparks died before reaching her. The fire left patterns behind her eyelids when she blinked. Orange, then red, then nothing. Her stomach tightened, not with hunger now, but with the weight of food sitting where emptiness had been. She adjusted her position, pressing a hand against her side as if to steady herself. The guilt came later, creeping in behind the warmth, behind the fullness. It showed itself in the way her fingers curled into the blanket again, in the way her jaw set as she swallowed. The harmonica dipped into a lower register, the note dragging. Smoke rolled across her face once more, and she turned her head slightly to avoid it. The movement brought the fire into a different angle, flames reflecting off the metal of a tin cup someone held nearby. The sight held her there, eyes fixed on the way the light bent and broke across the surface. Around the fire, no one spoke of war. No one spoke at all. They listened. They breathed. The sound of the harmonica carried on, and with it, something unspoken settled into the space between them. She did not look back toward the barn. She did not look down at her hands. She watched the fire consume what it was given, turning solid wood into heat and light, and somewhere in that steady destruction, a question formed, not in words, but in the simple act of watching something burn without being afraid of it. The flames leaned together again, and the night held its breath. Morning came without ceremony. The sun rose pale and low, spilling light across the ranch yard in long, quiet bands. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the slow movement of cattle beyond the fence, and somewhere metal clinked as a gate was opened and shut again. She stood near the barn doorway, the blanket still around her shoulders, wool warmed now by habit more than heat. The fire pit was cold behind her, ash-gray and scattered, its work finished. A small shape moved across the yard. It was the rancher's daughter, hair pulled back tight, boots too big for her feet. She crossed the dirt at a run, kicking up powder with every step. In her hand was a strip of cloth that flashed as it caught the sun. Pink, clean, bright in a way nothing else had been since the war ended. The color cut through the browns and grays of the place like a bell. The girl stopped in front of her and held it out without hesitation. The ribbon was smooth, lighter than it looked, the fabric cool where it brushed her fingers. The edges were neatly finished. No fraying, no stains. It smelled faintly of soap and clean cotton. She did not take it right away. Her hand hovered, then closed around it, careful, as if it might tear under her grip. The girl grinned once and ran off again, boots thudding, leaving the ribbon behind. She stood there with it draped across her palm. The sun warmed the cloth almost immediately, bringing the color alive. Pink against dust, pink against wool, pink against skin that had known only dull shades for too long. She lifted it slowly, the fabric sliding between her fingers, light as breath. One of the cowboys noticed first. He paused mid-step, squinting slightly as the ribbon flashed again. Another followed his gaze. A third shifted his stance, boots creaking softly. No one spoke. No one moved closer. She raised both hands to her head. The blanket slipped down her back as she gathered her hair, fingers combing through uneven strands. The ribbon brushed her cheek as she worked it into place, the smoothness a sharp contrast against skin roughened by wind and sun. She tied it once, then again, knotting it securely. When she let go, it stayed. The change was immediate. The ribbon sat bright against her dark hair, catching the light with every small movement. It drew the eye upward, away from the blanket, away from the ribs and wrists and scars. It did not erase what she was. It marked what she still could be. She adjusted it once, fingertips lingering for half a second longer than necessary. The cloth did not slip. It held. Around her, the men reacted without words. One tipped his hat and left it off this time. Another cleared his throat and looked away, jaw tightening. A third leaned against the fence, arms folded, eyes fixed on the horizon instead of her hair. Their silence was different now, not heavy, acknowledging. She took a step forward, then another. The ribbon moved with her, flashing pink against the muted world. Dust clung to her shoes, to the hem of her uniform, but the color remained clean. The physical anchor had shifted again, not warmth, not food, not paper, but something chosen, something claimed. She passed a reflective pane of glass near the ranch house and slowed. The image there was unfamiliar. The blanket still hung heavy around her shoulders. Her frame was still thin, but above it all, bright and undeniable, was the ribbon, a mark no one else had placed there. She did not touch it again. The cowboys watched her cross the yard, the ribbon visible from every angle. No one laughed, no one looked away. The transformation was too clear for that. It did not belong to them to question. When she reached the fence line, she stopped and turned once, just enough for the ribbon to catch the sun again. The light flared, brief and unmistakable. It was not decoration. It was evidence. The scale creaked again weeks later, but this time the sound was different. Not a hollow complaint, not a sharp protest. Just a brief metallic groan as weight settled evenly across the platform. The barn smelled cleaner now, less iodine, more soap and sun-warmed hay. Light filtered through the gaps in the boards and landed squarely on the dial, the glass wiped clear of dust. The needle jumped, wavered once, then slowed. It stopped. The medic leaned in, squinting, then straightened. He did not hesitate this time. His pencil moved smoothly across the paper on the clipboard, graphite scratching in a confident line. 102. He underlined it once. Firm. She stood on the scale without swaying. Her feet were still bare, but the skin looked different, less cracked, less angry. Her calves held shape now, muscle visible beneath skin that no longer clung desperately to bone. The blanket rested on her shoulders out of habit, not necessity, its weight familiar, almost ordinary. When she breathed, her chest rose fully, evenly, the motion steady enough to be boring. The pink ribbon sat neatly in her hair, faded slightly from sun and washing, but still bright enough to draw the eye. One of the cowboys let out a low whistle before he could stop himself. He coughed and looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. Another smiled briefly, the expression quick and unguarded, then tucked it away behind a neutral face. Hats were already off. No one needed reminding. She stepped down from the scale, The platform sprang back to zero with a clean click. The sound echoed lightly through the barn and disappeared. She rolled her shoulders once, testing the space they occupied, then reached up and adjusted the blanket so it sat just right. Her posture had changed. She stood straighter now, weight balanced, feet planted with quiet certainty. The physical anchor had completed its journey. It had been a circle in the dirt, a number on a dial, wool against skin, heat in a cup, graphite on paper, color in her hair. Now it was all of those things at once, carried in the way she moved through the space as if she belonged there. Outside, the truck waited. The engine idled low, steady, a vibration felt more than heard. Dust gathered around the tires, drifting lazily in the air. She stepped into the sunlight, the barn door sliding shut behind her, with a final familiar groan. The men lined up near the fence, not in formation, not evenly spaced. Just where they happened to be standing when the moment arrived. No speeches followed. One by one, hats came off. The motion rippled down the line, quiet and synchronized without planning. Felt pressed briefly against chests, then held at sides. She stopped in front of them, the ribbon catching the light as she turned. The blanket slipped from her shoulders and was folded carefully, passed back into the barn, returned to where it had started. She bowed once, not deep, not submissive, just enough to mark the moment. The cowboys tipped their hats in response, a mirror of the gesture, the brims cutting clean lines against the sky. No one stepped forward. No one reached out. The distance held, respectful and final. She climbed into the truck. The step was higher than it looked, but she took it without help, hands steady on the metal rail. The door closed with a solid thud. The engine revved, then eased forward, tires crunching over gravel. As the truck pulled away, she did not look back. The ranch receded behind her. Barn, fence, fire pit now cold and scattered. The men grew smaller, their hats still visible long after faces blurred. Dust rose and settled again, leaving the road unchanged. The scale sat alone in the barn, needle fixed at zero, its work complete. She had arrived surrounded, measured, and silent. She left upright, named by numbers that told a different story. And that is what the cowboys did. They stood still long enough for a life to change. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like this survive because people choose to remember them.